And really what they've gone out to do is deliver the most intense, gritty, and brutal World War II shooter that I think anybody's ever seen.
From being nearly scrapped as a project to being considered one of the greatest FPS games of all time, Call of Duty World at War was the biggest miracle in the Call of Duty series, and perhaps even one of the greatest in gaming history. Why though, you may ask? Talk to anyone familiar with the franchise and most of them will tell you that World at War is one of the greats. It's a timeless classic, a masterpiece, and it's even maybe one of their personal favorites. And all of those things can be true, but what you might be surprised to hear, World at War should have failed. This game, by all accounts of its development, confidence in the project, and even community expectation, Call of Duty World at War should have been a complete and utter failure. Now, this is not to be confused with the game World at War Final Fronts, that embarrassing unrelated PS2 game that was made to run on older hardware.
The whole mess is stinking jungle and son of a bugs.
It was developed by Rebellion Studios instead of Treyarch and has almost nothing to do with the real World at War, despite having identical box art and brand appeal. So Final Fronts did not feature a multiplayer mode or zombies and had very budget gameplay design and storytelling methods. It's basically a totally different game under the exact same branding. So I can understand your confusion, just wanted to clarify this video is about the real Call of Duty World at War and not any of its spin-offs. Anyways, World at War itself was a miracle that anything actually worked, not to mention having to live under the shadow of the titan that was Call of Duty 4, and somehow having to match that quality bar or even surpass it. Treyarch had a tall order to fill, and none of the reputation they possess today was even attributed to their studio. Infinity Ward was far and away the golden child to the community, making the great COD 2 and 4. Treyarch was known for making Call of Duty 3, which at that time was widely considered to be the worst game so far in the franchise. Oh, and also they made that hilarious Spider-Man game.
Bobby said,
Give me those. What is this garbage?
This was a very different Treyarch compared to what we're used to today, or even what made a game like Black Ops 1. Treyarch had not yet found themselves as a brand or as a studio. Their identity had not yet been established, and this left them scrambling to find out what to do with this game. What's insane is the fact that World at War as we know it was all slapped together in about 8 or 9 months instead of the 2 whole years they had to work with theoretically. While publicly they claimed to have been working on it the 2 whole years, realistically the first year or so was burned scrapping ideas and just figuring out what to do with the game to begin with. And the worst part was, the community was already kind of annoyed that they were getting another World War II game, since that had been the setting of every COD except Modern Warfare. It's very likely that Treyarch decided to do World War II again, in large part because it's already what they know, and the game needed to be put together rather quickly, but they still had to do something to make it stand out or to innovate in the same way that COD 4 did. Ironically, Treyarch have never made another World War II game since this one, and it's clear conceptually they probably didn't want to do World War II again, but were desperate to get something working, and it's partly this desperation is what I ultimately believe to be behind the miracle that is Call of Duty World at War. But how did that happen? This gives us the question, how did a game destined for failure ascend into being considered a literal masterpiece by the greater Call of Duty community today? 2008 was a very different time for the world and for myself likewise. I was just starting to find my taste in video games, and as a young 10-year-old at the time, I played COD 4 occasionally, but World at War was the first COD I ever played with any type of consistency. It was just a cornerstone of one of the many activities that my friends and I bonded over growing up, and being a naive 10-year-old, I was just playing the game oblivious to the fact that the game in my hands barely even made it out the door. The product I was enjoying was a literal Hail Mary for Treyarch and Activision, but I had played other World War II games like Medal of Honor prior to this, and I wasn't quite hooked the same way. That's because I discovered my true love on World at War, and it was also one of the things that made up most of my playtime. Matter of fact, what's crazy is that if a few different and less risky decisions for World at War had been made, and this little mode called Zombies never shipped, there's a very strong chance that I wouldn't even exist on YouTube at all, and this very video you're watching right now wouldn't even be real. World at War would be the first step in a journey that literally changed my whole life. Of course, I was blissfully unaware of that at the time, but that level of risk-taking Treyarch committed to with World at War is one of the more admirable things about it. But to get a clear understanding of the whole picture, this story can really be taken all the way back to 2007 and then shortly after the release of COD 4. Say what you want about Activision now, but at the time, they had a reputation for publishing high-quality video games, and a certain expectation and quality bar was expected to be met for every release. Call of Duty 3, by comparison, was less than impressive compared to the massive leaps that Modern Warfare would make that following year. So if Treyarch were unable to produce anything even close to that standard, Activision could have very easily dissolved their studio to just be support for Infinity Ward or something to that effect. Basically, this was Treyarch's one shot to prove themselves to everyone, and while on the outside, Treyarch displayed the highest level of confidence they could to the public, internally, it was a completely different story. Once again, try to wrap your head around the fact of just how disarrayed Treyarch were in these days. They didn't have the unifying force of Black Ops that brought them together as a studio quite yet, and they fumbled around with how they can even make something in the same league as COD 4. As the first year of development went on, the project went through a number of scraps and redrafts. Not too uncommon in game dev, to be fair, but the difference was they ultimately settled on another World War II game, probably because it was something they already had experience in and time was running out. But then they realized, oh crap, we can't just make the same COD 3 again, we gotta find a way to make World War II, again, a new and fresh experience.
We at Treyarch didn't want to go back to the same World War II. We wanted to completely redefine that, much the way that Modern Warfare kind of set that bar up high.
Now, to their credit, focusing on the Pacific Theater and the conflict of Russia and Germany in World War II was a distinctly new take on the material that they've covered up to this point. So, in about the last 8 or 9 months, work would finally begin on the game that we would know as Call of Duty World at War. If you look at the game now in hindsight, you can actually see where this game clearly had cut corners. The campaign, in terms of sheer playtime, is very short. Multiplayer doesn't quite have the same level of features that COD 4 had, and zombies, well, that wasn't even supposed to exist, but we're gonna get there. Now, that is to say nothing of the quality of those experiences, but in terms of sheer content, not including zombies, it doesn't even come close to the scale of Modern Warfare's offering. However, one advantage this game had as a result of being slapped together kind of quickly, and every component being more or less the same ingredients rearranged slightly, the game feels extremely unified as a result. Doesn't matter if you're playing campaign, multiplayer, or zombies, it all feels and looks like the same game, which gives it a really strong sense of identity. It plays like one complete package, and if that's not clear enough, let me explain what I mean with an opposite example. Black Ops 3 and 4. Again, without commenting on the quality of any component, it is objectively very disconnected. You got your futuristic multiplayer stuff with its various tones and mechanics, absolutely bizarre things going on in the campaign like neural technology, and then you compare that stuff with this, or this, or this, or this, or this, or this, or this. You look at zombies and it's either in old Chicago or it's a gladiatorial arena or a literal space rock, but you get the point. The parts of the game are left feeling extremely disconnected in a lot of ways, but the upside is there's probably something for everyone in there, but the odds are lower that you're gonna like everything in that game experience, if that makes sense. But just the point is, World at War's potentially strongest attribute was the fact that it has an unmistakable identity and the entire game plays like one complete unit. Man, even the main menu music, literally just me saying those words, it probably starts playing in your brain right now, and that's kind of my point. You know how recent Call of Duty's they change the menu music every single season, so it's always something different? World at War never did that. It was always the same song, but it's also one of the most haunting and memorable tracks of all time. But the whole tone of the game is darker and a more edgy experience than Call of Duty had done up to that point, but the game was still focused really on the gritty feel for single player and multiplayer, but it also just happens to have zombies built into the campaign menu, as that's how it was thought of initially. But that is to say, World at War has this instantly identifiable style to it. Not only that, but most of the choices in-game reflect that as well. It's a very faithful World War II experience, if you want to call it that, contrasting it directly with Vanguard, which is the exact opposite of strong identity, where that's a World War II game with like laser guns, futuristic Terminator skins, and embarrassing anime weapons. And look, a little bit of silliness is totally okay. I'm not against having fun in a video game, but if what you're going for is a game with an unshakable sense of identity, instead of this ambiguous, gray, and sloppy mixed pot of everything you can get your hands on, then World at War is the way to go and not Vanguard.
Big deal.
What's Call of Duty?
Hey, if you're enjoying the video so far, leave a like, and also consider subscribing if you're new to the channel and you want to watch more. Also, I've probably reviewed your favorite COD game at this point. If you also want to watch some more after this one, if I haven't got around to your favorite COD game yet, then likely I'm going to do that very soon. But anyways, hope you're enjoying, and let's continue. As much of a rough start World at War was projected to have, it would emulate a lot of the ideas brought to the table by Modern Warfare, these being the prestige system, create a class, and kill streaks. This is kind of what I like to think of as the holy trinity of what makes a Call of Duty game separate from any other FPS titles, and this was the first Treyarch game to include such features. While it did have some neat ideas on its own, like war mode being expanded upon here, partying up with friends became much easier, and the social backend elements of World at War were a lot better compared to Modern Warfare, but to be quite honest, other than that, World at War didn't really push any new boundaries for multiplayer like they would with their next title in Black Ops 1, but it copied a lot of new ideas that Infinity Ward had established, and I'm not even saying that's a bad thing, but when looking at the two MP experiences objectively, one was extremely innovative for the time, and the other was like a younger sibling trying to be just like its big brother, but just a slightly edgier version of said big brother. And while the MP is pretty fun, when we're being honest with ourselves, it's practically COD 4, but just in a different time setting. I mean, even the campaign is like way shorter than COD 4. It's got this weird co-op campaign thing going on, and even all those years ago, I still thought that mode was kind of pointless. It just wasn't very fun at all, especially when Halo had done co-op campaigns way better by that point. But just as a side note, the fact that a game in 2008, though, managed to have a campaign co-op at launch, and Halo Infinite does not, will never not be funny to me.
Yeah.
Anyways, my point is, when removing any nostalgia you might have for this game, on paper, it was very inferior in many ways to the previous game without pushing too many boundaries of its own. Well, until zombies, that was, but still, there's a reason World at War is so beloved now, and I think the reason for its miracle is about to be made much more clear as we examine the game. So, it's a bit of a mystery, but let's start with the crown jewel that is World at War's campaign. World at War has such a unique campaign when examining it closely, and maybe it's one of the more special ones that's ever been made, but looking at it at face value, there's no reason why that should be the case at all. This would be like the fourth Call of Duty World War II single-player installment, but what's different about this one is that it just isn't standard World War II material told in a traditional fashion. Case in point, COD World War II in 2017 was about as cut and dry and generic as you could get with the tone and the feel of the World War II story material. Sure, it was competent and even quality made, but it's something we felt like we've seen 1,000 times over with TV shows or other video games or, anything else in media. But I can say with all sincerity, World at War is really special in this regard, as it handles similar historical material, but with a very different approach. One of the major differences are, I guess there isn't a whole lot of plot to speak of other than showcasing the end of World War II from both the German and Russian side of the conflict and the US and Japanese Imperial Army dimension. So yes, part of its uniqueness is the difference in the setting and countries involved, but the bigger part is there's like this style, this underlying darkness and somberness in every single second of the storytelling. I feel like it's less about the literal events happening on your screen, but more about how it makes you feel, and this is made clear the moment you start the game and see real World War II historical footage. Once again, Black Ops would be very famous for the style, but World at War was the first to do this without feeling like they were censoring themselves at all. The game opens up with Private Miller captured as the last of his unit on a small Japanese island. The first scene sets the tone of the game within the first few seconds.
You think because you say nothing, you are strong?
Within 20 seconds, you know who the bad guys are, and you know why you're fighting them. You push through the village and get ambushed by these Japanese soldiers with extremely unconventional tactics. This opening mission is probably one of the most memorable moments in gaming, and I've never forgotten this mission, even as the years have went on. The gameplay of nearly all the World at War missions are fairly simple. You know, it's big levels of point and shoot at bad guys, with the occasional switch up of like doing some task or you're piloting a tank or something to that effect, but because of the budget and constraints they had, Treyarch had to do most of its storytelling in between missions. World at War still holds the record for the most amount of real and strikingly intense footage in cutscenes. These little slideshows help illustrate the progression of the war in a beautiful yet extremely somber way. When you're not playing as Private Miller and dealing with the Japanese forces, we're introduced to Dmitry and Reznov in perhaps one of the most haunting openings in Call of Duty. Both openings for our main characters are extremely effective, and it's this level of brutality and realness that help you connect emotionally with the main protagonist immediately, despite them both literally saying 0 words throughout the entire game. World at War does have the traditional A-B storytelling style, the A story being these guys, and the B story, these ones. I guess there is a C story, but this character is so inconsequential to the plot, I'm not going to talk about him too much, but it basically just serves a purpose to have more missions, and that's fine. But however, to different games, these stories don't end up merging by the end. They are told completely separately and never cross paths. So we have our 2 playable characters set up and their counterpart to deliver story to us in the form of Sergeant Sullivan for the Private Miller stuff, and then Viktor Reznov for Dmitry and the Russian stuff. Do you remember how I said this is World War II material, but told in the least generic way possible? For example, take this beach invasion on Little Resistance. Pretty straightforward stuff just on the surface, but just watch and listen to this small Easter egg, and you'll see what I mean about this like underlying mysterious and dark tone, and this is representative of everything. It's just like this art of like being really subtle and mysterious, and you don't even really know if this is even, you know, related to the rest of the game, and it lets your imagination run wild with it. But let's compare that to Vanguard.
Hey guys.
Wow, they really left this part in the game.
Don't everybody rush over.
Oh my god, how embarrassing.
But for the team, something that resonated even more with us were the real stories of the real people who fought in World War II. So these are diverse people from all around the globe, and
World at War is literally the definition of what I love about in-game storytelling, where everything is show, don't tell. In World War II 2017, practically every single scene and piece of in-game dialogue is just characters saying what they're going to do. I'm gonna go do this thing. We gotta blow this up. We gotta get over this thing. We gotta go fight this guy, etc. Whereas World at War is the exact opposite. You're shown things, and then your imagination is allowed to run with it. Like this. Or this, or this, or this. Point is, the way they show you subtle details about events without having to outright spell it out for you is very refreshing. In fact, the most powerful stuff in the game is the stuff they don't show you, or what flashes by you very briefly without dwelling on it. It's the art of subtlety, and I think games these days could learn a lot from this technique. Don't treat your audience like they're children and have to have everything spelled out for them, and just maybe the player will attach to the material a lot easier. Now, I want to draw your attention to the gameplay for a bit. So, as was par for the course at that time, the level design was typical for COD single-player stuff. Again, you've got rooms of bad guys, shoot through bad guys, and advance through the level. However, as mentioned earlier, World at War had a co-op campaign feature, and while I cannot say I found this to be particularly fun personally, it was interesting to have and was the first time Call of Duty had ever attempted a co-op campaign to my knowledge. Clearly, Treyarch was taking a lot of inspiration from Bungie and Halo, with World at War's equivalent to Intel. This campaign had death cards. These were little, like, playing cards scattered throughout the level, and each death card was some kind of condition that could be applied to your game to make it harder in co-op, or just alter the experience in some way. Death cards were super interesting, but were pretty much restricted to co-op use only. In Halo, for example, you can activate skulls and play the game solo and, change the experience. But in World at War, as far as I can recall, you could only use death cards during online co-op, which is probably the biggest drawback to that system. Despite being a fun idea, it was criminally underutilized. Also, the weakest points of the gameplay are the same as COD 4. The AI is extremely awkward and could break the sense of immersion very often. The visuals, again, by today's standards, are wildly outdated, but what was interesting is I found myself far more immersed still in this experience and story than I was in, like, Vanguards, for example, despite the latter having astronomically better technical visuals. And it's mostly for the reasons we discussed earlier about the subtlety in storytelling that really worked for me, and that was able to overcome the technical issues at almost every junction. Now, the level design can get a bit repetitive at times, yes, but they managed to make simple yet fun gameplay without overthinking it. I compare the tank sequences in World at War to World War II 2017. One game you just drive around and blow things up at will, which is the most fun way to use a tank, and then the other, you spend most of the game not shooting the tank, and they somehow managed to make a fun scenario like that utterly boring. But anyways, back to the story. Because this campaign is one of the shortest ever when it comes to running time, it means no mission is wasted. Each level is Private Miller and Sullivan leading your squad and doing everything in his power to get his boys home safe, even if it means making huge sacrifices, and then Dmitri and Reznov cutting through German forces, getting vengeance on their way to the heart of Germany. Now, you might ask yourself this: despite all the nuances and subtle storytelling and all that good character trait establishment, is it really that good of a campaign to be considered so highly? And just with those things in mind, on its own, no. But I think the real secret to World at War's campaign is ultimately its layers, and once again, doesn't feel the need to spell this stuff out for you. So I really look at this campaign as having 3 layers to the experience. Firstly, you have the literal, real historical events as they played out, documenting the events of World War II in that respect. You then have the way the characters of World at War specifically interact with that story, and then the, literal plot of this game. And then, without trying to get too philosophical, what I took away from this experience is the 2 sides of the story appeal to different parts of the human spirit. You have the spirit of selflessness and sacrifice represented in Sullivan, just a man who did everything he could, putting his men above himself to ensure their safety as top priority, even if it meant giving up his own life so that others could live. And then you have the spirit of vengeance represented in Reznov, an absolutely brutal and unforgiving force that will stop at nothing to see it to the end, even if it means massive carnage and destruction along the way. It's this duality that I really feel like is why a big part of World at War is remembered. This campaign feels like a very whole experience, even if we didn't know how to put that into words. World at War's themes have this level of sophistication that I think can be overlooked at times, and I noticed after I replayed this, it stuck with me for a few days. You all know sometimes, like, you watch a movie or you play a game, and as soon as it's over, it literally never crosses your mind again, but World at War lingered in my mind for a few days afterwards, and I think that was why. For the greater COD community, I believe something to that effect to be the reason it's rated so highly nowadays. It's definitely not for its gameplay, I can tell you that, but it was because World at War was tackling so many ideas and themes at once while retaining the fun as it relates to a gameplay experience. Also, it doesn't glorify war, even by the end, it condemns it.
That from this solemn occasion, a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding.
And that's pretty much where the campaign ends. Again, like, the literal events and the way that the A and B story wrap up isn't all that important in terms of, like, what literally happens. It's more about what it represents. And it does have a little more to this ending after the credits roll, but don't worry, we're going to get there soon enough. But World at War has one of the more serious COD campaigns and what I would consider to be the best World War II themed campaign as a whole. And while the gameplay or visuals aren't anything super special, it doesn't matter so much as its themes and ideas far outweigh the shortcomings of the tech. It's a great experience that doesn't overstay its welcome. It's really short but effective, and it's beautiful in so many ways. So, I'm about to say something potentially controversial. I know, crazy thing, opinions. But anyways, I've said this in older videos, but when it comes to explaining my thoughts on a game, I will usually say good is not always equal to fun. And I've had some pushback on that, where people will rightfully say, isn't the point of video games to be fun? And yes, you're right, but that's not really what I'm getting at. So let me word this a bit differently, and we're going to come back to this idea many times in the video. Enjoyment is subjective. Quality is not. That is to say, something can be objectively designed very well, but not be much fun, or the opposite can be true, where something can be designed incredibly poorly, but still be really fun and enjoyable. Let me be clear, most of the time, quality and enjoyment do go hand in hand, but not always is my entire point. So why did I lay all that out? That's because I think World at War's multiplayer is a case-in-point example of something not being of the highest quality, but still being incredibly fun and enjoyable subjectively.
Let me explain.
For all purposes, objectively, World at War multiplayer is just COD 4, but in World War II. Treyarch did sort of copy and paste Infinity Ward's homework with this one. Create a class, kill streaks, rank and prestige, and so on. I can't say that World at War really pushed any boundaries with this title compared to what Modern Warfare did and the revolutionary changes that they invented. The closest thing you can get to that is War Mode, I guess, and the tanks in multiplayer. Sure, they'd expand on some of those systems a bit, like you had a perk 4 slot specifically for tanks, and partying up was now made much easier in World at War, but as far as like big innovation goes, there wasn't really as much going on. They even directly copy and pasted the kill streaks, except the attack helicopter were changed to attack dogs, but radar and artillery were the exact same functions as the previous experience. Man, even create a class just feels a bit more empty and hollow in this game. There are less attachment options compared to Modern Warfare, and partly that's because it's in a World War II setting, but you get the point. Like, I'm also pretty sure there's less overall weapons also compared to COD 4. There's no gun camos, as they're trying to stay grounded in, realistic World War II material as well. Also, they didn't have the time or resources, I'm sure, even if they wanted to. But the thing is, they have the COD formula intact, which is great, but and they definitely put the Treyarch flair on this iteration, but in its own bubble, we'd be lying to ourselves if we said this was, massively groundbreaking or anything insanely innovative. Like I said, basically COD 4, but in World War II and slightly edgier. The biggest differences between these two experiences, however, besides the obvious stuff, is the map design. I've touched on the different philosophies between Infinity Ward and Treyarch maps, but Treyarch are more like 3-lane in nature without as many obvious power points. They're very cut and squared away and well-rounded. And like the maps are also generally bigger in World at War compared to what we're used to for typical Treyarch design, because War Mode and standard TDM-based modes will run on the same layout. The maps are very well thought out in their map design, and they would definitely be the first seedlings of what we would come to know as the classic Treyarch map formula. World at War would also change the spawn system in a big way, however, compared to Modern Warfare, and this is perhaps one of the biggest innovations, but World at War had a more complicated spawn algorithm that basically had positive or negative influencers to determine your next spawn point. For example, teammates indicate a positive influence, whereas enemies are negative, obviously, but even stuff like airstrikes or enemy vision or even just objective locations all help determine where your, next spawn point. It was just a more intricate system compared to the more static and fixed locations of Modern Warfare. I give World at War tons of props for its advancement in technical innovation when it came to its back-end systems, but as far as core gameplay goes, it's literally COD 4 just on different maps and with different guns. Perk selection was wide once again, but same issue with COD 4 as well. There's really only a few busted and really meta ones, and many perks just served zero purpose when it came to the meta of most multiplayer interactions. The tank system was neat, I guess, and the perks that came along with it, but feels hollow when you consider the fact that tanks were only on a specific few maps to begin with. Also, in hindsight, even fixing simple things like kill streak stacking, in Modern Warfare, if you got a helicopter before you called in your airstrike, it would disappear. Same thing here. It's like, annoyingly, artillery was almost never used because you would get dogs, really quickly afterwards, and then if you didn't use it, your artillery strike was just gone. So that was a bit of a drawback, and also the weapon selection is fine, I suppose, and there are obvious good and bad weapons. Like, why would you ever use an SVT when a PPSH or the Springfield exists? Like, the weapons were either really good or laughably bad. And I know it may sound like I'm being hard on World at War, and I'm really not trying to be overly critical or harsh, but I am pointing out all the ways it directly copied COD 4's formula or just failed to innovate on its own. With all of that being said, however, wrapping back to what I said at the beginning, I still find the multiplayer really fun and addicting. Sure, it's not the most unique experience ever created, and the lack of features were less apparent for the times, but in current day are borderline unbelievable, but it's not really fair to compare a game from 2008 to what we expect in 2022. At least it does illustrate very well just how far gaming and basic features have come since then. And while it might be considered bland or, God forbid, even considered a boomer shooter now, despite all that, it didn't stop many of us from having countless hours of fun with this experience. And do you remember how I said, remember how the game has a clear identity? You can certainly feel that in the multiplayer, as it doesn't compromise any of its features to add like artificial depth to its systems like other World War II games have. The multiplayer is still as unmistakable as ever as a whole package, and I guess it is for that reason it has the same core weakness that COD 4 has as well. It can just get a little stale after a while with, no variance and kill streaks. You can only get the same 3 streaks on the same maps over and over again before you feel like you've done it all. Same thing as Modern Warfare. To be fair though, this was Treyarch's first run at adding those features before they would really push the envelope with Black Ops 1, and to, cut back to what I was saying earlier, World at War is objectively very copy-paste at its core. The game is incredibly simple, which is its greatest strength and biggest flaw. I find it so interesting, though, how in current day, people tend to hold COD 4 in higher regard than World at War multiplayer. It just isn't as referenced or talked about nearly as much as the former. Like I said, little brother just trying to be like its big brother. Clearly, much of the lack of innovation was a result of the game being slapped together and the crunch to make things work. It wasn't as revolutionary as Modern Warfare, but it's just crazy how people hold this game in high regard, despite having many problems and basically being the exact same game as the one prior. Overall though, the multiplayer experience can still be enjoyed today. It's just the most bare bones version of the COD formula we all love, and if the World War II setting is something you particularly enjoy, then you'll get a lot out of this one still. Now, let's circle back to the campaign for a moment. Now, at the end of World at War, you beat the game, the credits roll, you've let it all soak in, and then this plays. Now, zombies is such an interesting discussion. Not only is this very near and dear to my heart, and when I think about time, I've literally been playing zombies for more years of my life than I've not been playing zombies. So, needless to say, this is going to have a real sentimental value to me. However, that doesn't get in the way of me analyzing this experience for what it truly is, blemishes and all. But possibly the most fascinating thing about Nazi zombies in World at War is, of course, it was never supposed to exist. Treyarch were scrambling to find new ways to make this game stand out for one reason or another. Imagine World at War had no zombies at all. Would it be remembered quite as much as it is today? I'd argue absolutely not. Whether you even played zombies much at all, it did so much for the identity of this game and, getting people to talk about it. But where did zombies come from? Clearly, it's just a little Easter egg after you beat the campaign, and that's all it was intended to be at first. In fact, it was considered crazy at the time to even flirt with the idea of zombies in a Call of Duty game at all. But some scripters over at Treyarch one day were toying around with the burning German soldier model animation, and one of them thought it kind of looked a bit like a zombie. So they ripped a small level from the campaign and put some UI up for a round counter and wall buys and so on, and made a bit of a cooperative survival experience. The end result was the weird but extremely addicting tower defense survival mode that internally everyone at Treyarch was playing, called Nacht der Untoten. Treyarch were obviously very excited about this mode, but how were they supposed to get get Activision on board with this to even greenlight it. They would need to get Activision executives one-on-one just to try it themselves and see the magic, with their own two eyes. It's just as possible this little slap-together mode could have never made the cut. And if so, my entire life would have probably gone in a much different direction, and the zombies community as we know it would fail to exist. Mark Lamia said it best when he states, "Zombies truly only exist because of the fans, and through the community's support and care for the game were they able to actually carry onwards."
Without them, zombies wouldn't exist as we know it, and we wouldn't have had the opportunity to make the games for them and craft the experiences that we do. And for that fact, we're eternally grateful to them.
The first Easter egg that was Nocturne Toten, or better known as the first ever zombies map, despite shipping to the game ultimately, it was still no surefire thing. It was unclear if this is as far as it would go, or if Activision would pull the plug on it eventually, but the beautiful thing is, with each map in this game, you can genuinely see new innovation and progression without destroying the fundamental layer of what made it fun to begin with. They were able to put more resources into each map that helped make them distinct, and that will become more clear as we get into each map individually. But first, I want to mention that the first seedlings of the storyline were also sowed here, and that was purely done through community theory crafting. This is why people love the original zombie storyline so much. We as a community were in a symbiotic relationship with Treyarch writing this story together. The community would speculate on things, and then Treyarch would actually pick and choose what to run with from those theories. In fact, I think it's hilarious, but the whole reason Samantha Maxis exists as a character is because some random zombie in Nocturne Toten sounds like it says Sam when making zombie noises, and the community ran with that, and so now in current day we have Samantha Maxis in a wedding dress. So, the first map, of course, would be the classic Nocturne Toten. I want to touch back on the concept of what we established earlier, where enjoyment is subjective, quality is not. Nocturne Toten is the most simple and bare-bones survival or tower defense gameplay as you can have. It's got a few wall buys, a mystery box, and some barriers. The level wasn't even curated for zombies themselves. What I mean is, like, nowadays, zombie maps are built with zombies in mind. Seems obvious, but Noct was literally just a campaign level, ripped and rearranged and, just thrown some zombies into the mix. It's not like it was built, preemptively with the undead in mind, but Nocturne Toten is a perfect example of, just being what it needs to be, and it was genuinely difficult at the time. Back in 2008 and 2009, getting round 15 to 20 was considered really good, and 30 was god tier. This was also before people really knew how to play zombies as well. The concept of hoarding or training wouldn't become popular until Black Ops 1, so most gameplay was holding out in a corner with your teammates or whatever until you were eventually overrun. It was simple, yet fun, and that anybody could pick up and play and understand the premise within the first few seconds. And while it always ends the same way, the pure addiction of wanting to push for higher and higher waves is what made me and millions of others truly fall in love with this game. Tower defense style games were also beginning to skyrocket in popularity in that year as well, and this was one of the better ones to say the least. The fact of its simplicity made it the most accessible experience there was, and there's also still little Easter eggs like the radio that changes songs, the sniper cabinet, but aside from all that, Nocturne Toten was pieced together from a bunch of little other parts of World at War to make the first ever true zombies experience. While Noct can be rightfully credited as the birthplace of zombies, so it is special in that regard, it's definitely not the best map by a long shot, but after realizing this was a massive success with fans, they were able to double down and put some actual time and resources into the experience, and thus DLC 1 would take us to Verrucht, or Zombie Verrucht as it's technically called. Verrucht, I think, is literally Nocturne Toten's gameplay loop, but just done better. There's more features, more progression without destroying the underlying mechanics. Verrucht takes place in an asylum, very similar to the multiplayer map and campaign layout, but it's a bit more curated for zombies this time. Verrucht would also introduce a number of new mechanics for the player to engage with. Most notable, of course, being the premiere of perks, Juggernog, Double Tap, Speed Cola, and Quick Revive. Also, traps would be introduced, giving us a new way to strategize and deal with zombies in higher rounds. We have to mention the unique spawn system in 4-player co-op as well. It separates teams into 2 halves, and all players must progress through the map and link up to turn the power on in order to be reunited, giving a clear objective to the player besides just surviving. It was also the first time the mystery box could move to multiple locations as well. Now, as much as these new features were great and revolutionary, Verrucht also made some fatal mistakes too. For example, quick revive in solo does nothing. This is a World at War problem more widely, but quick revive is great in co-op, but they didn't have the foresight to give quick revive a use in solo until Black Ops 1. Also, Verrucht specifically would have a new special kind of super sprinters. The community complained in Nocturne Toten that the zombies were a bit too slow, and Treyarch really overcorrected here, making zombies that are, much faster than the player can move. And with how sticky the zombies in World at War actually are, this turned out to be kind of a mess. The Verrucht-style sprinters would be scrapped after this map, thank God, but besides the gameplay, the atmosphere of the map is one of the most unforgettable, and according to many people, is still the scariest zombies map ever made, period. You have really subtle Easter eggs like the operating chair. Then you have the Illuminati markings on the wall in blood. This map was chock full of just raw material to speculate about what was going on in the story. That combined with the nightmarish tone and visuals made an unforgettable experience, and the narrative was really beginning to take shape. I think Verrucht is objectively a far better map than Nocturne Toten. You may enjoy Noct more, and that's valid, but Verrucht took that gameplay and undeniably added more, and that would continue in the next DLC map. The third zombies map in history we'd get would be the Zombie Swamp, or better known as Shinonuma, and this is special for a number of reasons. Firstly, it takes us out of the restricted play space for the first time. Noct and Verrucht were comprised of tight and cramped corridors and rooms, whereas Shinonuma is a mostly wide open swamp with plenty of room to move around in. It keeps all of the gameplay of Verrucht intact with its perk system, but in this map, it rewards you for exploring the map, and it randomizes each game of where the location of said perk is. Traps were still present in the form of the Flogger, but we're given some brand new things as well, namely the first appearance of our Zombies cast, who, funnily enough, all of their models are just reused from other characters within World at War, but they would be fully voiced this time around, and we'd see the first edition of special rounds as well. Every 5 rounds or so, you'd get dogs, and these were no joke in World at War. They're a bit of a meme in BO3 and 4, but they were an actual threat in this game. But besides that, Shinonuma would also have the first wonder weapon in zombies, not including the ray gun, the Wunderwaffe DG2. Something I felt made wonder weapons memorable back then was that they were so heavily contrasted with the standard World War II weaponry at the time. Think about it, if every gun is more or less like an old style ballistic rifle, this very historical thing, and then all of a sudden you get a space laser gun or an electric rifle, clearly these are going to feel a lot more special. Also, in terms of atmosphere and setting, Shinonuma is one of the most intriguing ones to date. The hanging soldier we now know as Peter McCain in the spawn room, the countless radios, even referencing Tunguska in the coordinates.
5544.94.
And even the bone-chilling telephone message. Shinonuma managed to be much more than a mere swamp filled with zombies. It was a totally different spin on the gameplay pace compared to the previous 2 maps, yet still managed to come into its own with innovative features in its own right. Shinonuma has a few problems though, and the fatal flaw, the elephant in the room, is the maximum zombies per round in this map was capped at 24. Period. So using the Flogger trap to get high rounds, meaning you could get into thousands of rounds with enough time, and the game just doesn't actually get much harder, it's a bit of a time commitment. The geometry in this map can be really janky, and you'll get stuck in seemingly random spots and die instantly because of how sticky the zombies are in this game, and the open layout did kind of deflate a lot of the tension in the gameplay at times, but it has so much fun stuff like the completely useless zipline and such that I can't help but feel a sense of real charm with the original Shinonuma. This map has been remade about 1,000 times over at this point, but something about the World at War version just hits different. Each zombies map was getting increasingly better as time progressed, and the zombies community was growing right alongside it, and then the big one would happen with the last DLC map that would change everything. But somewhere around this time, Treyarch would also add character bios for the first time ever in Zombies, with one of the most hidden and, well thought out Easter eggs of all time, using the letters from the character bios themselves to make a secret message. This is just a small example to show how intricate and layered the entire Zombies experience was beginning to become. And the map to show that off in flying colors the best would be the Factory. DRIGHT was the last map to come to World at War, and the season would end off with possibly the most influential Zombies map ever made. The Zombie Factory, as it was known, was able to truly send zombies out with a bang. Now, interestingly, Kino der Toten and parts of Call of the Dead from Black Ops 1 were supposed to be in World at War, but due to all the crunch and constraints that Treyarch were facing with World at War, they would have to save it for the next game. In fact, Kino is largely built from the theater in the campaign. But in any case, DRIGHT was the final map to send us off, and for what it's worth, deserved to be the crescendo. So once again, this map keeps everything intact from the previous maps and expands on things. DRIGHT is also the first map to have a real progression and reward system. You spawn in, kill zombies, gather points to open doors, you discover these teleporters that can be linked back to spawn. Each time that happens, a door comes down a little bit to this crazy looking machine, prompting you to find all of them. In doing so, you do the same for all the 3 teleporters, and by that point you've explored the whole map and are now rewarded with a system to upgrade your guns so that they stay viable longer. This is the map I'd argue that Zombies as we know it really began to take form. This alone added such replayability, and the best part was it kept everything that made the maps before it great and integrated it into something better. Taking guns that are borderline useless in later rounds, now go and pack-a-punch it, and it's either way stronger or has a totally different effect. Pack-a-punch is now the core staple in Zombies. It's one of the most fun parts of exploring a brand new Zombies map, and makes the weapons a lot more interesting in a way that you couldn't have dreamed of. It also has the first real interactable Easter egg. You shoot a control panel outside the map and find 3 items in a little like Samantha hide-and-seek game. You don't really get a reward for this admittedly, but the reward was kind of knowing about it in the first place. I find DRIGHT beautiful as well because it caters to all kinds of playstyles. There's so many ways to play this map that it'll feel fresh on your first playthrough or your 1000th playthrough. You can run around and train, you can camp on the catwalk, and so on. While it's not perfect, it's got its flaws, such as the Wunderwaffe taking away your Juggernog when firing it on this game for some reason, and all the aforementioned issues with World at War more broadly, but I still truly believe DRIGHT to be the best and deepest Zombies experience in World at War. Once again, you may enjoy the other maps more, and that's totally okay, but what I think is inarguable, DRIGHT is the highest quality map in the game by a mile. The story really began to find its footing here as well, with actual characters being established like Dr. Maxis and such, mini radios detailing the events at the factory. It has a certain energy and feel that makes this map timeless to me. Again, just like Shinonuma, it's been remastered countless times at this point, but it doesn't have any bad versions. DRIGHT is the premier Zombies experience in a way, and I truly think Zombies would be nowhere near as famous today without it.
So to our fans around the world, we look forward to carrying on that conversation with you in the future. That is, if we haven't started already.
World at War Zombies is incredible because as you're playing the maps in order, you can literally watch the mode grow up. You see it at its infancy. I mean, hell, in Nocturne Toten, power-ups didn't even have icons. It was just words. And it slowly becomes more and more developed and sophisticated, adding bells and whistles along the way, all the way to DRIGHT, where it becomes its own fully fledged mode capable of standing on its own 2 feet. Most of World at War Zombies' problems are technical ones, like, sticky zombies and solo quick revive, things like that would be ironed out in Black Ops 1, but it's truly beautiful to see a grassroots mode that wasn't even supposed to exist in the first place become one of the most defining features in Call of Duty in current day. Call of Duty World at War was a truly special game and an absolute miracle for the franchise. The true miracle, I think, lies in the subtle genius of the campaign storytelling and the risk that was Zombies. While the multiplayer is incredibly fun, I cannot honestly say it's anything out of the ordinary. It has an amazing campaign, a fun but somewhat lackluster multiplayer, and a revolutionary Zombies co-op mode. But the miracle of World at War and how this game managed to come together is a truly one-in-a-million success story.